Hannibal trapped and slaughtered 70,000 Romans in just 6 hours. Rome, August 216 BCE. The Republic controlled the Italian peninsula, fielded the Mediterranean's most disciplined legions, and believed itself invincible. For 2 years, a foreign general named Hannibal Barca had shattered that belief. He'd crossed the Alps with elephants and an army no one thought could survive the journey. At the Trebia River, he'd butchered 30,000 Romans. At Lake Trasimene, he'd drowned another 15,000 in ambush. Now he stood on Roman soil, burning villages, slaughtering livestock, daring Rome to face him. The Senate could not tolerate this humiliation. Rome had never surrendered to a foreign invader. It would not start now. Rome appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius refused to fight Hannibal directly. Instead, he shadowed the Carthaginian army, harassed supply lines, scorched earth ahead of enemy movements, turned war into slow starvation. The tactic worked. Hannibal's men grew hungry, his allied tribes grew restless. But Rome grew impatient. Citizens demanded blood, not patience. Senators called Fabius a coward. They wanted the traditional Roman solution: overwhelming force, head-on collision, total annihilation of the enemy in open battle. When Fabius's term ended in 216 BCE, the Senate elected 2 new consuls with one mandate: find Hannibal and destroy him. The consuls were Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Varro was a butcher's son, ambitious, aggressive, eager to prove his worth through decisive victory. Paulus was a cautious patrician veteran who distrusted open battle against Hannibal's superior cavalry. The Senate gave them 8 legions, 86,000 men, the largest army Rome had ever fielded. Half were inexperienced, rushed through training, drawn from lower classes after property requirements were abolished. But numbers would compensate for inexperience. The plan was simple: mass the heavy infantry into a dense battering ram, smash through Hannibal's centre, crush him through weight and push. It had worked for 500 years. It would work again. In spring 216 BCE, Hannibal seized Cannae, a small village in Apulia holding Rome's largest grain depot. The capture placed him between the Romans and their food supply. It commanded the surrounding farmland. It was deliberate provocation. Varro and Paulus marched south with their massive army, found Hannibal encamped near the Aufidus River on August 1st. The plain was wide, flat, perfect for cavalry maneuvers, exactly what Hannibal wanted. He controlled the river, the only water source. He positioned his camp so Romans would face east into the morning sun. The southeasterly wind would blow dust into their faces. Every detail was calculated. Hannibal didn't just choose a battlefield, he designed a killing floor. On the evening of August 1st, both armies camped within sight of each other. Hannibal offered battle. Paulus refused, sensing a trap. Roman custom dictated the consul's alternate command daily. August 2nd would be Varro's day. The aggressive consul wanted his glory. That night, Hannibal sent cavalry to harass Roman water carriers, denying the thirsty army access to the river. Romans spent the night hearing their comrades' screams, watching shadows dart through moonlight. By dawn, 1,000 men were dehydrated, exhausted, and angry. Hannibal's officer Gisgo remarked on the massive Roman army's size. Hannibal smiled and replied, "There is one thing more astonishing you haven't noticed, that among all those thousands, not one is named Gisgo." He was joking, but the joke would become prophecy. August 2nd, 216 BCE. Dawn broke blood red over the Apulian plain. Both armies crossed the Aufidus River to the southern bank. Varro deployed his 86,000 men in traditional Roman formation. Cavalry on the wings, infantry massed in the centre, deeper and narrower than usual, designed to punch through enemy lines like a fist through parchment. Hannibal arranged his 50,000 troops in a crescent shape. He placed his weakest troops, Gauls and Spaniards, in the centre, bulging forward toward the Romans. His elite African infantry stood slightly back on both flanks. His cavalry, 10,000 strong and superior to Rome's 6,000 horsemen, anchored the wings. The formation looked vulnerable. The centre appeared exposed, ready to break. It was bait, and Varro swallowed it whole. The battle began with skirmishing. Light infantry from both sides, Roman velites with javelins, Carthaginian slingers from the Balearic Islands darted forward, hurled projectiles, withdrew through the heavy infantry ranks. The exchanges were indecisive, inflicting few casualties, merely testing resolve. Within minutes, both sides recalled their skirmishers. The real battle was about to begin. The morning sun climbed higher, shining directly into Roman eyes. The southeasterly wind picked up, carrying dust and grit across the plain. Romans squinted, raised shields against the stinging particles. Hannibal's men stood with the wind at their backs, vision clear, breathing easy. The environmental advantages were invisible to Varro. He saw only the bulging Carthaginian centre waiting to be crushed. The cavalry engaged first. On the Roman right, 400 citizen cavalry faced 6,500 Gallic and Spanish horsemen. The clash was brief and brutal. The Carthaginians, fighting on horseback since childhood, wielded longer swords and superior tactics. They smashed into the Roman cavalry like a hammer into clay. Roman horsemen, bred for infantry support rather than mounted combat, broke almost immediately. Hundreds were cut down in the first minutes. The survivors fled toward the Roman rear. On the opposite flank, 3,600 allied Italian cavalry faced 3,500 Numidian light horse. The Numidians didn't charge. They circled, harassed, feinted retreat, lured the Italians into pursuing, then wheeled and struck from unexpected angles. Within 20 minutes, both Roman cavalry wings were defeated. The infantry stood alone. Varro watched the cavalry disaster and made his fatal decision. He ordered the infantry forward. 80,000 Roman and allied heavy infantry began their advance. A massive rectangle of armoured men, shields locked, spears levelled, moving like a single organism. The ground trembled under their boots. The sight would have terrified any ordinary army. Hannibal stood in the centre with his Gauls and Spaniards, personally commanding the weakest point of his line. As the Romans closed, he gave quiet orders. His centre would not hold its ground. It would give way slowly, controlled, deliberate. The crescent would curve inward, drawing the Romans deeper. The Romans saw the Carthaginian centre buckling and assumed they were winning. They pressed harder. The Roman front ranks crashed into Hannibal's centre. Gauls and Spaniards, fighting with large oval shields and long swords, met the Roman onslaught with fierce resistance, then began stepping backward. It wasn't a rout. It was choreography. Hannibal moved among his men, shouting orders, maintaining cohesion as they withdrew step by step. The crescent shape inverted gradually, becoming concave, pulling the Romans into an ever-deepening pocket. Roman commanders at the front believed they were breaking through. They called for reinforcements. Reserve lines pushed forward into the growing bulge. The Roman formation, designed for frontal assault, began compressing. Men in the rear ranks advanced into shrinking space. The Roman advantage, numerical superiority, was transforming into a fatal weakness. As the Roman centre pushed deeper into the Carthaginian line, the formation lost its shape. The carefully organised maniples, Rome's tactical units, merged into an undifferentiated mass. Soldiers found themselves packed shoulder to shoulder with barely room to move. The Roman fighting style required space, room to throw javelins, swing swords, rotate fresh troops from rear to front. That space was disappearing. Men in the middle ranks couldn't see the enemy. They could only push forward, following those ahead. The heat became oppressive. 86,000 men generated a furnace of body heat on a cloudless August day. Dehydrated from the previous night's water denial, soldiers began dropping from heatstroke before they even engaged the enemy. While the Roman centre drove deeper into the Carthaginian pocket, Hannibal's African infantry on both flanks had been waiting. These were his veteran troops, men who'd fought across Spain and through the Alps, wearing armour looted from dead Romans at Lake Trasimene. They'd stood still during the initial engagement, positioned slightly back, invisible to Roman commanders focused on the centre. Now Hannibal gave the order. The African infantry wheeled inward, attacking both exposed Roman flanks simultaneously. The Romans, compressed and disorganised, couldn't respond. Units tried to turn to face the new threat but lacked room to manoeuvre. The African troops fought with one-handed spears and swords, stabbing into the tightly packed Roman mass. Men died without space to fall. They remained upright, held in place by the press of bodies. The Carthaginian cavalry, having routed both Roman wings, didn't pursue the fleeing horsemen. Instead, they followed Hannibal's pre-battle instructions. The Gallic and Spanish cavalry from the Roman right circled behind the Roman infantry. The Numidians from the left did the same. They met behind the Roman rear, completing a full encirclement. Then they charged into the Roman backs. Legionaries in the rear ranks, already compressed and overheated, suddenly faced cavalry attacking from behind. Men screamed warnings, units tried to reverse formation. Chaos spread like plague through the packed ranks. The Roman army, 86,000 strong, now fought on all sides simultaneously, Gauls and Spaniards pressing from the front, African infantry crushing from both flanks, cavalry cutting into the rear. The formation became a cauldron. And the killing began. The Roman infantry, compressed into a space roughly 800 by 400 meters, could no longer fight as organized units. The tactical sophistication that made Roman legions dominant, the ability to rotate fresh troops, the coordination of maniples, the disciplined spacing, all vanished. Men stood packed so tightly they couldn't raise their arms. Swords became useless. Soldiers at the edges fought desperately while those in the centre could only wait. The Carthaginians encircled the mass completely and began working inward methodically, killing from all directions simultaneously. Historian Victor Davis Hanson would later calculate that nearly 600 Roman soldiers died every minute once the slaughter began in earnest. It was industrial-scale killing using Bronze Age technology. The plain at Cannae became an abattoir. The compression grew tighter as perimeter soldiers fell and the encirclement contracted. Romans in the centre experienced something unprecedented in ancient warfare. They began suffocating. Packed body to body in August heat, unable to move, breathing the exhalations of thousands of panicked men, soldiers collapsed from heat exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. Some fell and were trampled. Others remained standing, held upright by the press of bodies even after death. Livy's account describes men found after the battle, with their heads buried in holes they'd dug in the ground, dirt packed over their faces, having suffocated themselves rather than face slow death by sword. Others were discovered with slashed tendons, begging Carthaginians to finish them. The battle had become something beyond combat. It was entombment by flesh. Among the Carthaginian troops, the Iberian warriors wielded a weapon that proved devastatingly effective in close quarters, the falcata, a forward curved sword designed for chopping rather than thrusting. In the tight press of bodies, where Roman gladius swords were too long to maneuver effectively, the falcata excelled. Iberians hacked downward into the Roman mass, the curved blade generating tremendous force on impact, severing limbs, splitting shields, crushing through mail armour at the shoulders and neck. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield would later reveal bones bearing distinctive curved cut marks. The weapon was so effective that Roman survivors spoke of it with particular horror. Some claimed the Iberians could decapitate a horse with a single blow. In the crush at Cannae, they decapitated men by the hundreds. Among the trapped Romans was Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the cautious commander who'd opposed this battle. He'd been wounded early by a sling stone but continued fighting, trying to maintain some semblance of order. As the encirclement tightened, his position became obvious. Roman standards clustered around him, officers shouting orders, bodyguards forming defensive circle. The Carthaginians concentrated fire on this position. Paulus took multiple wounds. Accounts vary between arrow strikes and sword cuts. His bodyguards died around him. A Roman officer offered him his horse to escape. Paulus refused. He would not abandon his men. He died fighting in the centre of the collapse he'd predicted. With him fell both quaestors, 29 military tribunes, 80 senators, or men of senatorial rank. Rome's entire command structure was being decapitated. The Roman military standards, metal eagles mounted on poles, each representing a legion's honour, were sacred objects. Losing a standard meant eternal shame. Soldiers died protecting them. At Cannae, as the encirclement tightened, Carthaginian troops specifically targeted standard-bearers. One by one, the eagles fell. Men who'd sworn to defend them were cut down, and the standards disappeared into Carthaginian hands. Each fallen eagle represented not just a tactical defeat, but a spiritual one. The legion whose standard was captured ceased to exist in Roman law. Its soldiers, if they survived, became men without unit, without honour, without home. By mid-afternoon, most of Rome's eagles lay in enemy hands. The Republic's military identity was being systematically erased on a dusty field in Apulia. Consul Gaius Terentius Varro, the aggressive commander who'd insisted on this battle, watched the disaster from the rear. As the encirclement closed and panic spread, he made a decision that would haunt him for life. He fled. With approximately 70 horsemen from the shattered cavalry, he broke through the Carthaginian lines and rode north toward the town of Venusia. The flight saved his life but destroyed his reputation. He was the supreme commander who'd led Rome's largest army into its greatest defeat, then abandoned his men to die while he escaped. Ancient sources would vilify him for centuries. Livy portrayed him as a low-born coward, Polybius as a reckless fool. Fair or not, Varro became the scapegoat for Cannae. His name became synonymous with catastrophic military failure. The sun reached its zenith. The slaughter had lasted 4 hours and showed no signs of ending. The Carthaginians, though winning decisively, were exhausted from continuous killing. Some accounts describe Carthaginian soldiers resting on piles of Roman corpses, drinking water, then resuming the butchery. The Romans still alive in the centre had long since abandoned any hope of victory or even organised resistance. They fought individually now, small groups trying to break out, knowing it was futile. The battlefield had become a landscape of horror, blood mixed with dust, creating a thick mud that made footing treacherous. The stench of opened bowels, voided bladders, fierce sweat, and death was so overwhelming that some Carthaginians vomited while killing. This was war stripped of all glory. Livy's account includes a detail so disturbing that later historians questioned its veracity. He describes Carthaginian soldiers found dead after the battle bearing bite marks and scratch wounds. These men had been wounded but alive when Romans, pressed so tightly they couldn't use weapons, resorted to attacking with teeth and fingernails. Men died clawing at enemy faces, gouging eyes, tearing throats with teeth like animals. The account might seem implausible, but it reflects the psychology of men trapped in an enclosure where death was certain, where every instinct screamed to fight, but no room existed to wield a sword. Some Romans, their arms pinned by the press of bodies, could only use their mouths. They died biting. The battle had devolved beyond tactics, beyond warfare itself, into pure animal desperation. Small groups of Romans on the outer edges of the encirclement attempted breakouts. A few hundred infantry managed to cut through the Carthaginian lines and flee toward the smaller Roman camp established before the battle. Perhaps 2,000 more broke toward the town of Cannae itself. Another 7,000 retreated to the larger Roman camp. These were men from the rear ranks who'd never fully engaged, who saw the disaster unfolding and ran before the encirclement closed completely. They were the lucky ones. The majority, over 60,000 men, remained trapped in the killing zone. By early afternoon, escape was no longer possible. The Carthaginian encirclement had solidified into an impenetrable ring of cavalry and infantry. Those still alive in the centre could only wait for death to reach them. As the afternoon wore on, resistance collapsed into isolated pockets, then individual struggles, then nothing. The Carthaginians worked inward systematically, clearing the battlefield section by section. Romans too wounded to fight were executed where they lay. Some begged for mercy. The Carthaginians showed none. This was war without ransom, without the gentlemanly customs of prisoner exchange. Hannibal had learned that Rome didn't negotiate. It only understood total victory or total defeat. He was delivering the latter. By late afternoon, the screaming had mostly stopped. The battlefield was carpeted with bodies. Estimates range from 50,000 to 70,000 Roman dead in a space smaller than a modern football stadium. The corpses lay so thick in places that the ground itself was no longer visible. 6 hours after it began, the Battle of Cannae was over. Those Romans who escaped to the camps faced a different kind of horror. They'd witnessed the annihilation of their comrades, watched the entire command structure die, seen the sacred eagles fall. Many were wounded, all were traumatized. Polybius reports that survivors exhibited signs we'd now recognize as combat shock: uncontrollable shaking, inability to speak coherently, 1,000-yard stares. Some refused to eat, others couldn't sleep, jolting awake at every sound. The men who'd fled to Cannae town were surrounded by Carthaginian cavalry and surrendered the next morning. Those in the camps attempted to regroup. Eventually about 14,000 managed to reach the town of Canusium. These survivors would never fully recover. They'd experienced something unprecedented in Roman history, the complete destruction of a Roman army by a foreign invader on Italian soil. Hannibal's men began the grim task of counting the dead. Following Carthaginian custom, they collected iron rings from the fingers of dead Roman senators and equestrians. The aristocracy wore distinctive insignia. They filled 3-bushel baskets with rings and sent them to Carthage as proof of victory. From fallen Roman officers, they collected armour, weapons, standards. The corpses themselves were too numerous to burn or bury properly. They would be left to rot, a warning to any Romans who later passed this way. Carthaginian casualties were estimated at 5,700 to 8,000, mostly Gauls and Spaniards from the centre who'd borne the initial Roman assault. The loss ratio was approximately 10 Romans dead for every Carthaginian. Hannibal had executed the most perfect tactical annihilation in military history. As sunset approached, Hannibal stood on the battlefield surveying his victory. His cavalry commander Hannibal approached with a bold proposal: march on Rome immediately. The city was 250 miles north, lightly defended, panicked. With the main army destroyed, Rome lay vulnerable. Hannibal claimed they could dine on the Capitoline Hill within 5 days. Other officers agreed. This was the moment to end the war. But Hannibal refused. His reasons remained debated. Perhaps he lacked siege equipment to crack Rome's walls. Perhaps his army was too exhausted. Perhaps he hoped southern Italian cities would now defect, starving Rome without direct assault. Livy reports that Hannibal replied, "You know how to win battles, Hannibal, but you don't know how to use victory." The decision not to march on Rome would haunt Hannibal's legacy forever. Word of the disaster reached Rome on August 4th, 2 days after the battle. A rider brought the message that Consul Paulus was dead, most of the army destroyed, Varro alive but in flight. The Senate met in emergency session. Praetor Marcus Pomponius addressed the citizens gathered in the forum with 5 words that would echo through Roman history. "We have been defeated in a great battle." Panic erupted. Women flooded into the streets, wailing, demanding news of sons and husbands. The Senate quickly imposed order. Women were forbidden from public mourning. Crowds were dispersed. Business was suspended. A day of national mourning was declared. But beneath the forced calm, terror reigned. Rome, for the first time in its history, faced the real possibility of complete destruction. The Senate's response revealed both Rome's desperation and its resilience. They appointed Marcus Junius Pyrrha as dictator, granting him absolute authority. They lowered military age requirements to 17. They armed 8,000 slaves, promising freedom for service. They formed emergency legions from debtors, criminals, anyone who could hold a weapon. When Latin allies offered to send senators to replace the 80 killed at Cannae, the Senate refused. Roman dignity required that Romans alone fill Roman seats. Most dramatically, they performed human sacrifice for the first time in over 2 centuries, burying alive 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks in the Forum Boreum to appease the gods. The Romans were terrified enough to abandon their civilized principles, but they refused to discuss surrender. The word peace was forbidden in the Senate chamber. News of Cannae spread across Italy like wildfire. Cities that had remained loyal to Rome through Hannibal's earlier victories now reconsidered. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to Hannibal, offering him winter quarters and support. Tarentum followed. Then the Bruttians. Then cities across Campania and Apulia. In Sicily, Greek cities revolted against Roman rule. King Philip V of Macedon signed an alliance with Hannibal, opening a new front. For Rome, the political damage exceeded the military catastrophe. The alliance system that gave Rome control of Italy was unravelling. Hannibal's strategy, break Rome not through siege but through isolation, was working. The republic that had dominated Italy for 2 centuries suddenly controlled only a fraction of the peninsula. Rome's empire was collapsing from within. Mago, Hannibal's brother, sailed to Carthage carrying the rings of dead Roman senators and news of the victory. The Carthaginian Senate erupted in celebration. This was revenge for the humiliation of the First Punic War, for the loss of Sicily, for the heavy indemnities Rome had extracted. Mago reported that in 4 major battles, Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, Hannibal had killed over 200,000 Roman and allied soldiers, captured 50,000, killed 2 consuls and a master of horse. He'd annihilated 6 consular armies. Rome's military was effectively destroyed. The Carthaginian Senate voted to send reinforcements, supplies, and money. Across the Mediterranean, kingdoms that had feared Roman power now sensed opportunity. Rome, the rising superpower, suddenly appeared mortal. The balance of power in the ancient world had shifted in a single afternoon. Days after the battlefield at Cannae remained a charnel house. Local peasants approached cautiously, finding a landscape transformed. Bodies covered every metre of ground. Some corpses were stacked 5 deep. The August heat accelerated decomposition. Flies swarmed in clouds so thick they obscured vision. Wolves and dogs came down from the hills, feasting. Crows grew so fat on human flesh they could barely fly. The stench carried for miles. Romans who later passed through the region reported that nothing would grow on the battlefield for years. The soil was too saturated with blood and decomposing tissue. Archaeologists excavating the site centuries later would find bones bearing cut marks, arrowheads embedded in vertebrae, and soil with abnormally high iron content from blood. The earth itself remembered what happened at Cannae. Cannae entered Roman consciousness as something beyond a military defeat. It became a national trauma, a collective nightmare from which the Republic would never fully awaken. The battle demonstrated that Rome wasn't invincible, that foreign generals could outthink Roman commanders, that numbers and courage weren't enough against superior tactics. For generations, Roman mothers would frighten children with the name Hannibal. The phrase, "the day of Cannae," became shorthand for catastrophe. Military commanders throughout Roman history would preface battle plans with, "We must avoid another Cannae." The Senate would eventually forbid forming armies as large as the one destroyed at Cannae, fearing that concentrating so many men risked repeating the disaster. Rome had been psychologically mutilated. But the wound would teach the Republic something crucial: adapt or die. Despite the catastrophe, despite the defections, despite Hannibal standing victorious on Italian soil, with Rome's southern allies flocking to his banner, the Roman Senate made a decision that would define Western history. When Hannibal sent envoys offering peace negotiations, the Senate refused to meet them. When Carthage offered to ransom Roman prisoners, Rome refused. The Senate declared that any Roman captured at Cannae had disgraced himself by not dying, and therefore was no longer a citizen. Buying them back would reward cowardice. Instead, Rome doubled down. They raised new legions, trained new officers, reformed their tactics. They returned to Fabian's strategy: avoid pitched battles, harass Hannibal's supply lines, bleed him slowly. The decision was insane by rational calculation, but it was quintessentially Roman. They would rather die as a nation than surrender to a foreign invader. Hannibal would remain in Italy for 13 more years after Cannae, winning smaller engagements, holding his southern Italian allies, but never achieving another decisive victory. Rome avoided the pitched battles he wanted, instead grinding him down through attrition. Slowly the defecting cities were recaptured and brutally punished. Capua was sacked, its senate executed, its population enslaved. Tarentum fell. One by one, Hannibal's Italian allies were eliminated. His requests for reinforcements from Carthage were ignored. Domestic politics and the war in Spain consumed Carthaginian resources. By 203 BCE, Hannibal was recalled to defend Carthage itself against a Roman invasion led by Scipio Africanus. At Zama, in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal using the same encirclement tactics Hannibal had perfected at Cannae. The war Rome had nearly lost at Cannae ended in Roman victory. Carthage was broken forever. Cannae forced Rome to revolutionize warfare. The disaster proved that the traditional legion system, heavy infantry and rigid formations, was vulnerable to superior cavalry and tactical flexibility. Roman military thinkers studied what Hannibal had done and adapted. They improved cavalry training. They developed more flexible formations, eventually creating the cohort system that would dominate European warfare for centuries. They learned to use terrain, to avoid fighting on enemy terms, to value tactics over numerical superiority. The reforms that began after Cannae would produce the professional Roman army that conquered the Mediterranean. Ironically, Hannibal's greatest victory became Rome's greatest teacher. By destroying Rome's army, he forced Rome to build a better one. The republic that emerged from Cannae was harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than the one that entered the battle. 2,000 years after Cannae, generals still study Hannibal's double envelopment as the perfect tactical battle. Count Alfred von Schlieffen, architect of Germany's World War I strategy, wrote an entire treatise calling Cannae the perfect battle, and modelled his invasion of France on its encirclement principles. The Schlieffen plan failed, but it killed millions trying to replicate what Hannibal achieved in 6 hours. General Norman Schwarzkopf cited Cannae as inspiration for Operation Desert Storm's flanking manoeuvre. Dwight Eisenhower wrote that every ground commander seeks the battle of annihilation. He tries to duplicate the classic example of Cannae. Napoleon marched through the Alps just to walk where Hannibal walked. Frederick the Great, von Moltke, and countless others attempted the double envelopment. Most failed. Cannae remains the unreachable standard. The day 50,000 men destroyed 86,000 through geometry and discipline. Yet Cannae's legacy contains a bitter irony that military historians still debate. Hannibal won the most perfect tactical victory in history and lost the war. His refusal to march on Rome after the battle became the most analysed decision in military history. The Senate refused to negotiate. Rome refused to surrender. Hannibal's Italian allies defected back. His reinforcements never came. Carthage itself grew distracted by other wars. 13 years after Cannae, Hannibal was defeated at Zama using his own tactics against him. Carthage was destroyed. Rome emerged as the Mediterranean's uncontested superpower. The lesson embedded itself in military doctrine. Winning battles doesn't guarantee winning wars. Tactics are not strategy. Annihilation on the battlefield means nothing if the enemy refuses to quit. Cannae taught the world how to achieve perfect tactical victory. It also taught that perfection isn't enough. Rome never forgot Cannae. The 70,000 dead represented 1/5 of all Roman military-age males. Entire families were extinguished. The Senate lost 1/4 of its members. But the trauma forged something unprecedented, a state that refused to accept defeat regardless of cost. After Cannae, Rome fought wars not for glory but for survival, total wars where surrender was inconceivable. This mentality would carry Rome through centuries of expansion. When Carthage was finally defeated in 146 BCE, Rome didn't just conquer it, they burned it to ash, ploughed salt into the soil, sold the population into slavery, and erased the city from existence. They annihilated Carthage as completely as Hannibal had annihilated their army at Cannae. The republic that suffered history's greatest tactical defeat became history's most ruthless imperial machine. Hannibal taught Rome to be merciless. August 2nd, 216 BCE, 6 hours on a dusty plain in southeastern Italy. A battlefield smaller than a modern stadium. 70,000 men died there, crushed together so tightly they suffocated standing up, killed by geometry as much as swords. Rome's largest army was destroyed. The Republic's invincibility shattered. The Mediterranean's balance of power shifted. And yet Rome refused to surrender, chose adaptation over extinction, and eventually conquered the world that thought it broken. Cannae was the day ancient warfare reached its tactical zenith, the perfect execution of encirclement, the mathematics of death made manifest, but it was also proof that perfection has limits. You can win the perfect battle and still lose the war. You can slaughter 70,000 enemies and still face 70,000 more. At Cannae, Hannibal proved his genius, and Rome proved something stronger than genius, the refusal to die.